Thought you'd given up on us.
Good morning, Kathryn. It's changing schedules, so it's not as easy to make it as has been in the past. But I'm here. Good to see you.
So what's new with you?
Oh man, beavering away. I guess summer in Newport, Rhode Island is new. That's so change of season's quite dramatic in that it goes from one set of activities to another. So sailing is ramping up, which is pretty fun. And where to start? There's always new things and lots of things going on.
Well, you look really happy.
Yeah, you look refreshed.
Good to be visiting that.
It's hard to understand what you're saying, though.
Yeah, you're going in and out. Your connection is not great.
Yeah, unfortunately, that does happen in this location.
That's
I'll try.
Woo.
So good morning, Ani. How are you?
I'm good now. I've been just, taking care of yourself is a full-time job, isn't it? Yeah, I've had this little thing on my neck and an inflamed wart that's benign
Ah,
that I have finally addressed and done what I needed to do and taken care of the wound. But I'm good. I got a new book I really like. Natural Capitalism.
oh yeah. It's
About
an old one.
the city in Brazil. I don't think it's old. You think it's old?
Paul Hawken? Who's the author?
Yeah. Paul Hawken and
Yeah, it's old.
is it?
Oh yeah.
Well, it sounds innovative. I mean, it's innovative though.
Yeah, well, he was always on the forefront.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It's nice to know there's a city in South America, in Brazil, that's really advanced in thinking.
Well, there was at that time. Things have changed dramatically in Brazil. Oh yeah. Yeah, they had the last, not this current president, but the one before that was absolutely delighted in destroying the biggest trees in the Amazon he could find. He's got pictures of him standing in the middle of this huge tree. I mean, he was responsible for really destroying the Amazon.
Oh my.
Yeah. And that slowed down with the new president, but I don't know that it stopped because of all the things that the first one put in place. So, yeah, no, Brazil has got problems now.
My goodness. Yeah, it's hard to understand some people's thinking sometimes.
Yep.
Their motive, their frame of reference.
Greed and power can do a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I had a bout with food poisoning this last week.
from what? What'd you ingest?
I think it was a turkey burger that I made, some turkey that I had bought, ground turkey. I actually bought it for the dog, but then I decided to do a turkey burger.
Wow.
Not a good choice. Boy. So I'm still feeling the effects of it a little bit, but not a whole lot.
So it was spoiled?
It
Or
must have been.
yeah.
I mean, it didn't smell bad or anything like that, but it must have had a bacteria in it that did not go well with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're okay now.
I'm much better. Yeah, no, it was just 6 hours of anguish.
Pretty much out. It's out of your system now, though.
Well, my stomach still goes, really? But it's not horrible.
I like that phraseology.
Oh, so, but I did attend yesterday, actually, an all-day conference on water. That was really wonderful. I'm just very impressed with the kinds of thinking that some of the people in the environmental field have. Oh, they were just amazing. And there was a lot of attention on the indigenous folks. So they were very much included at many levels. And so I made some really good contacts. So I'm kind of excited about all that. It was a good conference. It was worth spending the time.
Good.
So
Anything on the upcoming agenda for people you're inviting into dialogue with?
not specifically. The next real event, is June 20th. And it's focused on biochar. So I'm going to have some international experts on
Oh,
biochar
I
there. And it's virtual, so I don't know, Mark, if that's of interest to you as well. But it is free and it is virtual. It'll be hybrid, actually. And that's on the Soil Smart, Soil Wise website. And you can see the list of presenters and all that. So if it interests you, feel free to do that or share.
wanted to give you some feedback. I mean, just
Sure.
my own personal quirkiness, but I guess, but when you make reference to biochar, the image that comes into my mind is a product, is a substance, not
It is.
system.
It is.
Not from my investigation. It's an interrelated system of a natural system of water, and it's a system. It's
No, it's really a product. It's a tangible thing that you put on your soil or in your soil and you make.
That's not what I get from my investigation of it. Strange.
Yeah, I don't know what you're seeing. Yeah, because it is a tangible product and people do make it. And that's part of the thing, is how to make it, at what level, quantity, size you want to make it, what the source material is, how it's charged after it's made and how it's applied. I mean, it's a whole big thing.
So you can buy
You
bio
can. Yeah. Yeah, you can buy it, you can make it yourself.
when I looked at your website and looked and grokked what you were saying, it was more a natural interaction of systems than it was something you can go to the store and buy.
Yeah, no, you can, well, you can't buy it in all stores. I think some gardening stores do carry it. You can get it on Amazon. And it's really an uh, uh, an element of interest, I guess, in the agricultural field because it can do a lot for farmers, but it has some issues. Applying it is one issue. And it needs to be mixed with compost to really be instantly beneficial. But it's being used for other things as well. Because people are all interested in carbon sinks. It is a carbon sink. And so there are places where you're actually paid to do biochar because you're getting carbon credits for it. So there's that aspect. And some folks are using it as a filter to remove toxins from water and soil, which it also does. So it's got lots of different applications. And so there's a lot of depends in terms of how it's used.
So you can go to the store and buy biochar and put it in your soil.
Yeah, you can in
Oh,
some places. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the places that I know of on the west side of Washington, that's what she does. She has a large production for home gardening biochar, basically.
okay, because I tried to inform myself and the information I gave myself is not exactly true then, because
So yeah, I'm just curious. I don't know. Mark, have you looked at the Soil Smart website by any chance? Just because there is a page on biochar. And it's kind of high level. It doesn't get into a great deal of depth, but and most of that has been pulled from other the two foundation groups that are working with Biochar International and the Colshane Foundation in Seattle.
I think I have been on that website. But to me, like, I guess, like many things, I looked at like biochar as a thing, and it seemed reasonably straightforward as to what it was and what it does. And I'm like, okay, cool, got it. Time and place. You know, when I'm in a situation where I either need to be engaging with it or advocating for it, then by all means. But it's yeah,
Not a
not
life
like
focus.
immediately in my not immediately in my uh yeah immediate activities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
And
yeah, it makes reasonably rational, logical sense to me.
yeah.
Especially like when we compare to like
we lost you.
the historical act into I'll say it again, like historically how like either by indigenous groups when they like burn forests and you get that like layer of char that then forests regenerate from, like that sort of more natural historical origin. Yeah, it'll just makes sense.
Yeah, it actually came from the Amazon. Amazon Indians did it and created terra pareda, which is a soil we still can't replicate. And that soil grows a foot a year. So it's pretty impressive, but we've not been able to create anything quite like it. And it's like 30 to 40% biochar. So yeah. So there's just a lot we don't know about it. And we're trying to figure it out in our very Western way by creating lots of parts and pieces. So it's become quite a complex thing as opposed to the fairly simple thing it must have been from the indigenous point of view, because they just burned what they had and put it in the soil and paid attention to what it did. So it must have been fairly simple originally.
We do complexify things,
Yes, we do. We do. That's definitely there.
but so does evolution.
Yeah, yeah. And we're trying to the other attempt in the biochar world, which is kind of interesting, is our need to standardize. So trying to create standards that we can replicate from the mechanical perspective instead of really paying attention and having a more of a relationship. So they're working really hard on that.
Nicely put.
Yeah. So
What else is going on in the world? Oh God.
well, one of the things that's come out of the water conference for me, I hope really, and it will be working with the tribes, which should be fabulous, is a really strong interest in forest. because they have a really strong interest in forests, and nobody at the conference at all had any inkling of the biotic pump. So that was not a term anybody recognized. Um, and that's sort of a double-edged sword because it makes it a little bit less credible because they hadn't heard about it. But also it's also intriguing. I did find that when I explained it, people really got it. And I also found that all of the experts were, sort of holding it out here. Uh, so it'll be interesting if I can engage a couple of very principled people, actually, who I did talk to. They hadn't heard it before. Yeah, okay. I mean, it doesn't sound untrue, but it doesn't ring for them, and they don't trust it yet. So
Because when you say biotic pump, there's a mechanism that comes to our minds. It's like
right. And that's what forests are. They are that mechanism between water in the water in the soil and water in the sky. That's how it gets there. They pump it up, quite literally.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And when you say biotic pump, it doesn't take you to the imagination does not go to a natural system. It goes to a mechanism. And so if you could do something with that, people would.
It's not my words. I didn't coin it. And it's in the official papers that validate it.
I totally agree with everything you're saying.
And I hear what you're saying.
I'm talking about languaging here to communicate what you want to communicate. And if all you do is say the biopump, it's a mechanism. It's not a system in people's minds. In my mind, I mean, biotic pump.
Yeah.
That you can go buy or something. But biochar is something else, and biotic pump is something else. If you could see how to present it in a way, how to language it in a way that people could have an image of what you're saying.
Well, I'm open. If you can think of a way, if anybody has words that talk about the system, because that's what it is. It's a system. It's not.
Then include that in your introductory statement.
Oh, I do. I do.
You didn't with us. You didn't with me. I didn't know it was a system until I looked it up. I just thought it was a pump.
Okay, well, I usually do say that it is a whole system, and that's the point, that it is a system. It's put together old information that we have in a new way, which shows us a system that we did not see before.
Yeah, it's an interactive system of soil and water and what else?
And plants. Yeah, I mean, it's new information that we get rain from plants. Okay, that's 60% of the rain internal to a continent comes from plants. That's like kind of a new understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we know that plants transpire. That's not new. It's just that we didn't see that pump action, which is not just the trees bringing it up, but the fact that it flows through the system.
What's another what's another word for pump in this context? Because a pump is like, it's a mechanical thing.
Yeah. Well, and the other term that I've seen is hydrologic regulation. I don't know if that's any better.
Make something up that works. Let's work on it. Yeah, because what you're saying is important.
Yeah.
But the languaging of it makes a difference if people can
Well, and it makes a difference who I'm talking to, too. So if I'm talking to the scientific folks, they really like biotic pump. I mean, it resonates much more as an official kind of term. So, yeah, so there's that.
Yeah. Where'd you
And
get?
I did find at the conference that the pump idea was actually useful for people because it really put the forest in the position of making that water flow happen, which is what is true. So it's really integral to that system that you can't, yeah, and really seeing how important, which I think actually I'm really hoping when the tribes get that, it will give them a really strong way of talking about that to the government. Because part of the issue with the BMW or yeah, it's BMW, BM something, BML, Public Bureau of Land Management, maybe it is BMM, BLM, that's what it is. The BLM and the Forestry Service are that forests are really seen as plantations of trees. And that's as plantations of trees. That's what they're planting, and that's how they see a forest, as a plantation. They don't see it as an ecosystem. So they feel quite comfortable in taking stuff out without understanding the implications of removing trees. And they don't see the value of old growth because it has high timber value in an ecological term.
left
But
over.
this really makes an ecological case for old forest that I think the tribes could really use well.
Yeah. It's just
So
the term left over from colonization, some kind of like the forest is something to colonize, you know.
well, and that's what we've done. I mean, Paraguay has reforested themselves totally with plantations. I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible. It's transformed their economy. They're all oriented around the export of timber. And plantations do not do anything to nurture the soil because they're monochromatic. The soil needs diversity in order to really be alive. So they're diminishing their soil capacity by doing that. I mean, they've just, it's such a mess. I can't even, oh, it's horrible. Yeah. And, you know, and we've done it in other places too. Washington has really been big. I think a lot of the forests that we have, our plantation forests, were planted. And we're busy, we're really busy doing that. Spokane's got $12 million to plant trees with absolutely no understanding of the forest or the soil or their relationship to the other plants around them at all, or how they're planted. They're often planted on a hill, on a mound, instead of in a cave, a bowl that would hold water around them. When it does come, it would stay there long enough to go down, and they don't do that. So, I mean, there's some simple changes.
What is, I don't know how this is going to come out. It's a question for you about your life work and where you're headed and what you want and the influence that you want to have with the knowledge and understanding that you have, which is profound. Well, what do you want to become, and in what framework? In terms of advisor, in terms of innovator, how can we support you in whatever you would call that?
Yeah, I think it's still forming actually. And it's really the for me, if I can keep a strong focus on the biotic pump, because I think that understanding is so key, and make that become an integral driver, especially of policy at the policy level, both state and city and national would be great. That will have the biggest impact that I can think of on allowing us to thrive through the changes that we're going through. And it would also give us the most agency in impacting those changes. And it gives us a rationale, a clear rationale that's life-centric for making economic decisions that we have not had before. So it seems to me to impact us in so many different levels and to put us back into the system of nature in a very real way,
Yes.
to really understand how we are part of that and necessary to that, without having people necessarily to take the indigenous path or to make really major mental changes initially. But I think as we begin to really explore what it means to have a forest, for instance, I mean, that's where autopoiesis and diversity just live. I mean, that to really understand that, and that's been one of my questions about my own work. I'm not sure how to bring the values into this exactly in a way that seems coherent and not, a sideways trek, but certainly ecologies are really where all of that lives. And you can't have an ecology without diversity. And the agreements that those living things make really speak to the autopoietic nature of life. So there's openings there, I think, to begin to bring that out in our understanding of how life works, which hopefully will flow out into the rest of the world, We'll begin to see how some of the things that we have accepted, like separation and like standardization, just are truly anti-life. They just don't work. And I was reading an article on philosophy the other day, and he was making this case about how we can do things in our mind and it's really all mental and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm going, bullpucky. If your philosophy is not grounded in life, then it's a fantasy. I mean, because you can make up things, you absolutely can, but there's no premise, there's no foundation under it. It's just empty.
Right.
And we spend lots of time angels on the head of a pin. Oh my God. Why would you care? What a conversation. It was huge at one point in our history. It was a huge philosophical issue. I mean, doesn't make sense. There's just so much about the real world that we can ruminate on and learn from, but it's tied to reality. And when you want to know where truth is, I don't know a better place to look. It's whether it enhances life is whether it's true or not. All the rest of it is just puddle stuff. It doesn't matter. If it doesn't support life, then what's the point?
So I'm drawn to the languaging of I'm drawn to make more vital the languaging that you're using about biotic pump, because it's nature's it's a system of nature.
Yes.
And the word itself does not direct our minds to nature when you say biotic pump. So I didn't mean to hold my hand up. I didn't do that.
Yes, you did. That it's decided, it's been trained now that you can through hand gestures.
Oh, really?
Stimulate some of those. Yeah. And you can make hearts, you can do all sorts of things with hand gestures if you kind of get you and your computer together. It's kind of fun. Yeah.
AI is taking over my screen. but if I mean, I so admire what you're saying and doing, and I so want to support it with the languaging that people would get it right away. And nature, I mean, biotic pump doesn't turn my mind to nature. And biotic pump is nature's process. Nature's process, and but languaging it, I'll keep playing with it. But if you can think of a way,
Yeah, I do talk about how this is how we make rain, how rain happens. And that's kind of has caught some people's imagination that we now understand how to make rain. And this is how nature does it. And we can support nature's process in doing that by understanding the system by which that happens, and that it needs all the parts. Like any system, it doesn't function if a part's not working. So we can have swales, but if the soil under swales is not porous enough to hold water, then it's, marginally useful. Some water will go down, of course, but a lot of it will evaporate if the soil won't hold it. So you got to have that piece. You got to pay attention to the soil instead of assume, which is right now not often done. I mean, Spokane spent $5 billion creating swales and tanks to hold water, but it wasn't thinking about water going down particularly. It was thinking of holding it till it could move into the river. And I don't know enough about that system yet to know whether the swales themselves are really designed to go down, and if there's any way to get the water from the tank into another kind of system that will allow it to go down instead of pushing it all off into the river, which is what we do. So I'm not sure how the city can change what they've invested in a way that supports this, but they'd have to really be invested in the pump in order to do that. They really would have need a strong rationale and really see the benefits to making those very strong monetary investments to do that change. And that's one of the reasons that the science piece is so important, because it is not an opinion. It really is something that would make a difference to the city. And China so far is the only place that I've found that has done writing about how it's important in their city. And they have a whole policy of creating sponge cities across China. And that's something that we should do. That would be I mean, if we could do that worldwide, we'd have a real chance of making a difference. That would have such an impact on the environment, on the weather environment, in a very positive way. But it would really have to be at that kind of massive scale to really make a tipping difference. I think a local scale will give that local place a lot more resilience for a time. But again, you're in a larger system, so there's a point at which you really have to have the rest of the system working with you. So the more cities, the bigger spaces that can do that, agriculture, to really begin to see how they're part of that and what they can do. And the Miyawaki forest is just like the perfect little piece to put in there, because individuals can do Miyawaki forests. They don't need outside help.
what's the word? Milwaukee?
Yeah, now he's the guy in Japan who created the method.
Created the method of what method?
It's a foresting method. So it's a way to recreate the original forests that were in a place. And now probably there needs to be some mitigation because of the heat, because it's not going to be the same temperature it was originally. So there's going to have to be some changes. But the point for me is when you go back to the original, you've got centuries of agreements between those living beings to be together. They know how to live together. They've figured it out. That's why the forest is resilient, because they're all supporting each other. And those agreements don't happen overnight. They take centuries to happen. So that's why old growth forests are so important, and why going back to the original plants is so important, because those agreements are already inherent in those plants. When
Okay.
you put plants together that haven't lived together before, they still have to figure it out. And we have so little time that we really need that resilience, and we need the health that that resilience builds in the soil to keep that pump going, to keep that process going.
Now,
And that brings back diversity too, because the critters come back to that original place because they remember their homes. So it brings back birds and insects and reptiles and all those things that people haven't seen for years.
and it isn't fungus instrumental.
Yes, yeah. And that only is in a forest. See, that's the problem with trees and plantations, is that you don't get that. You don't get a lot of that microbial activity because it takes more than a tree to do that. It takes a bunch of trees and probably other plants too
And
to feed.
fungus. And my
Well, that's what the fungus feeds and relates to. So you need all of the beings it needs there, which is why I go back to the original stuff, because those agreements are already there. They don't have to figure it out.
but maybe you could add the mycelial, I mean the fungus part of it.
Yes.
It's
Well, it's part of soil amendments. If you can add compost, you can speed up that compost approach with biochar, and then you can and if you amend it, you're adding things like protozoan, bacteria, fungi, and nematodes. And they're all specialized. They're not a thing, they're a plethora of things in those categories. So you have to know what your soil needs. And it can be different from yard to yard. It could be different a mile away. So you have to pay attention. That's a science thing. You have to bring in experts to look at your soil and then to say what to add, which is why I don't talk about it a lot, because it means people have that. It's a big step to do that, to really pay attention at that level. And I would encourage anybody to do it, but it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's just really different. So it's just easier to do both biochar and compost, and you get a big bang for that buck. So it's not, there's no detriment to it.
the the interactive system though is just so fascinating.
Yes.
It turns you on.
Yeah. No, there's so much there. And these are all job opportunities. So that's the other partnership that I'm starting to make with some people in Spokane, is people who are interested in jobs. So you can be trained to be a soil scientist. The Soil Food Web is a place they can go, and in 2 years, they have credentials and equipment and certification to be soil scientists, and they can go out and add nematodes and bacteria and fungi and protozoan to soil. So if they have that interest, there's a job opportunity. If you want to do landscape design, Zach Weiss will train you in understanding how the land needs to be shaped to hold water. Those people are so overwhelmed. There are not enough of them. I mean, they all have these huge lists of people they will never talk to, because so many people, when they get it, want to do it. So there's a huge opportunity for people who want to do that. It's a great job. And you can do it on a small level, people's yards, or you can do it on a citywide level or a regional level, depending on where you're being hired. So
Well,
all of those places have opportunities for that.
what would that as an industry be called?
It's regenerative landscape design.
But it's more than landscape design, because
It is.
when I hear that, it's like how to make something beautiful for rich
Right.
people.
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
what
And they also talk about it as um, reviving dry land, because that's for agricultural and some of the bigger land users, that's an issue. So they can revitalize dry land by putting in a design that will hold it. This also comes out of permaculture. Permaculture has a lot of this, but not on the scale as a rule. But they have this understanding.
So
And they do.
is permaculture, or I've got a couple friends who are permaculturists, but I haven't engaged with them in this kind of a conversation. Are permaculturists the people to interact with to develop this industry?
They're helpful, for sure. They see levels of planting, which is true in the forest. See, that's the other thing about forests. It's not all trees, it's levels of planting. So you plant all those levels at the same time. Permaculture doesn't necessarily plant things at the same time. They're not thinking of forests, they're mostly food oriented, but they plant their food the way the forest grows. So there is a lot of connection between the two. Part of the challenges I've seen with gardeners is that they don't really think about larger systems. They think about gardens and they don't see it as a regional issue. They see it as a gardener issue and gardens, and going from garden to garden, they don't see the rest of their land as connected to their garden even. Permaculture is maybe, gardeners not so much.
So Mark, in your listening to this conversation, I'd be interested in whatever comes up for you. If anything.
Yeah, I mean, a ton of things. I think, like the first thing I'd say, yeah, I'm tracking and sort of in agreement with what's being shared, both in terms of sort of the, what
We're not getting voicemail.
Simplify as being like the fundamentals that Kathryn. Let me just stop my video. How about now? Can you hear me better now?
Oh, much better. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Let's try this. So yeah, I think in crude summary, like I hear the fundamentals that you're speaking of, Kathryn, and that all makes a ton of sense. And then certainly from your perspective, Arnie, that like that language is important and such a huge part of fundamentals connecting with people ultimately in a way that influences their understanding of the world and their action taking. So it all kind of sort of tracks quite clearly for me. There was something earlier that was said. Yeah, maybe give me a moment and keep talking, and I'll chime in. I think there is something else that I wanted to bring in, and yeah, let me just get a grasp of it.
Okay.
One of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of Soil Smart in particular and trying to build that organization. One of the people that I've been talking about and who's been willing to be on, we're calling it the board because I don't have another word for it, is Carl Welty, whom you might know, Mark, from some of the other conversations, but I don't think you do, Ani. He's an architect, but he's also a philosopher and an artist. And he comes at architecture from that perspective and is very centered on nature's way of doing things and how to bring that into building. and that kind of stuff. So orienting things to the sun so that you can make use of the passive solar capacities that are already inherent in the system instead of using extra energy and all of that kind of stuff. So he is the voice in Soil Smart for the land and the developer perspective. So part of that is landscape design, regenerative design, getting developers to develop the land to hold water before they build, and then to get them to think about building in a way that uses what nature already provides us so that we're reducing our dependence on external stuff in every way that we can. And he's really brilliant at that.
What's his name?
Carl Welty. He's on a website under team. And I'll put their bios up today. I started it, but I didn't finish it. And share
WLT.
WELTY.
Okay.
And then Sharon Nielsen, who and I don't know Sharon very well, so this is kind of where I kind of got yesterday. Carl and I spent almost 3 hours talking about stuff, and it's very much like a deep dive because one thing takes us to another, and we try and get at the foundational things and keep it congruent and all of that. So it's very similar. And I realized that I don't know Sharon very well. And Carl brought her in. She's got great expertise. Her expertise is in affordable housing. She's retired. She has a huge background in federal of housing projects and in funding them. So she understands those systems, and she is a systems thinker. So she does get the implications of things. And again, from the developer perspective, one of the big pushes right now, especially in Spokane, which is what I can speak to, is from the affordable housing perspective. They're getting billions of bucks to build. And so here's a perfect place to begin to make real some of the things we're talking about, and to work from a policy perspective to require developers to think about these things. So we're working, so Susan or Sharon and Carl are creating a list of people who should be on the team to create policy for Washington and Oregon State for developers of affordable housing to think about working with nature and what that means to create a resilient result instead of one that's creating more problems for ourselves. So that's part of that. But the key for me, and where the deep dive is so significant, is it's these kinds of really deep conversations that keep us congruent and help us see the other connections that need to be managed to make real what we're trying to do in the real world. So this is, for me, a real exercise in living out the values. Okay, you got values. That's really nice. What is it? How does it reflect in your life, in what you're doing, and how you think about things, and how you make choices? We want to be good people, so we want to be kind and honest. Fantastic. How does that help you make decisions that keep life alive? Not at all. You can be kind and sweet and absolutely destructive to nature. I'm sorry. The two are not necessarily connected. And so making those connections real for me is just part of the fun of all of this. This is where it gets juicy and it gets interesting to do that in a way that's coherent and not coercive and not any of those other kinds of things. Not to be better than or whatever, but to just make it work really well for everybody for a long time. And in order to do that, it's got to be connected to nature, because if it's not connected to nature, it won't work really well for a long time for all of us. So, I mean, it's just, and what does that mean? Because we're still going to build houses. We're still going to plant food. We're still going to exchange, make stuff, invent stuff. So how do we do that in this context? What does that look like? And you can't talk about it. You've got to do it, because you don't know what it looks like until you got your feet on the ground and deal with real problems that come from the real world. Then you know what you're talking about, and then you know what to talk about. But you can't do that in an abstract way. That's been some of my frustration with the regen government and economic folks, because they're not practical at all. They're not doing anything to test out their thinking to see what that looks like. What do we need to address and engage with to make these dreams come true? And I don't think it can be done without action, without real tangible doing stuff.
Let me ask you a question. I have the opportunity to talk with the owner of the senior housing project that I live in. What, and we don't live by a body of water here in Santa Barbara, El Patio Gardens. What, coach me, how would I gear my conversation with him to bring it into a regenerative, innovative framework? Because he owns a lot of properties.
So probably risk management.
What's that?
Well, risk management is the industry that looks at the possible problems you could have and how you mitigate them. So one of the issues that's really cropping up everywhere is that things are no longer insurable. And they're not insurable because we're having these huge weather events, right? Well, oh my God, they've got to pay for that. Well, not if it's an act of God. If it's an act of God, they don't have to pay for it. Or the insurance companies can choose not to cover flooding, which is very common. So if you want insurance, which means that if you have property damage, you don't have to pay, somebody else pays for it, basically. That's an issue. And it's also an issue if you want to sell your property and it can't be insured. So states like Florida are having huge issues with all that wonderful coastal property. Nobody's insuring it anymore because it's at the effect of floods, it's at the effect of tornadoes and wind and all that, and they just don't want to deal with it. But you as a homeowner are then caught with, what are you going to do if you have a problem? You've got to pay for it.
Let me inject something here. I was turned down to make a community garden in where I live in senior housing. We got plenty. We got some land that's just wasted there, and I wanted to turn it into a garden, and they told me for liability and insurance purposes they couldn't allow me to do that.
Sure.
What the hell does that mean? What does that mean?
So they're worried about somebody getting hurt, and that's one level of insurance. However, I don't know. I mean, these are things I would have to look into. I can't tell you to do because you have to know more about it than I know to see what the reality is and how it applies to where you are. But if your site has flooding potential,
It doesn't. It doesn't.
Well, flooding comes from rain, not from rivers, from rain. And if California is getting more rain than it ever had before, which it is, then flooding is a potential. And it came out of drought. The thing about drought is that heat kills soil. The soil gets too hot for the organisms to live. So it becomes hard and compacted, and it won't accept all that rain. The rain just falls off of it. That makes flooding. One of the solutions is to make your soil porous to hold the rain instead of getting rid of it. Do you see the connections?
Sort of.
So the gardening can be a way to make that soil porous so that the rain that falls in that location will tend to go down, and he might want to invest in landscape design to hold that water there so he doesn't have issues with flooding. And the stuff on my on the Soil Smart website from Davis, California, the Village Homes, is a designed neighborhood that has done all those things for 50 years. And they have had no flooding with 5 inches of rain. That's astonishing. And they do not have an infrastructure that's filled with concrete pipes because they spread the water out. They want to keep the water on the land, not get rid of it. So their infrastructure is designed to let water slow down and stop long enough to go down. And they planted trees and other things whose roots have followed that water. And those roots keep the soil porous. So
Well,
it's a mutual system.
what is that process called?
Don't know.
Regenerative landscaping or what?
Well, it's designing for nature. It's designing with nature so that you're taking advantage of that pump and becoming part of it. Davis is a perfect example of a pump that works. They are 15% cooler. They've had no flooding. People can live off the land. Some residents get 75 to 85% of their food from the fruit trees and the gardening that they do there. They have 60 acres, 360 homes, I think, 25 multifamily, apartments, 8 businesses on the 60 acres. So it's a very complex, has all the little pieces of a city that you want to have, and it's very self-sustaining, and their property values have gone sky high.
What language would I use to engage the owner that I will have opportunity to dialogue with?
That's why I'm suggesting risk management, because they stopped you before because they were worried about a risk. But these are other bigger risks that gardening can help him address, actually.
Okay.
But you need to know enough about it that you can really talk to it. So,
right. Okay.
I mean, that's why we're looking at that ordinance, because it would be so helpful to cities and to residents if developers had this in mind before they built, so that they could really help the land hold the water, create these green spaces that we really need, make it possible to have that green stuff around. And they may not have to actually lose units in building, but they have to be more creative in how they build so that the two work together, which is where Carl comes in.
What ordinance? You mentioned an ordinance. What ordinance? A city ordinance.
Ordinances.
Ordinances.
Yeah, so ordinances are like laws that say you have to do certain things. So we have ordinances that talk about water quality. We have ordinances that talk about the amount of organic waste that needs to go in landfills or can't go into landfills, kind of things. So we could have an ordinance that says new development all needs to be graded in such a way that the land will hold water.
Oh,
We could do that. And then new development would be more in line with what nature wants to have happen in a place instead of ignoring it. We make everything flat and build on it. It's like a blank piece of paper.
is there a particular name of an ordinance that,
No, and I don't think there's been anything like this. So that's what we're working to develop.
okay.
Yeah, so I don't know answers to that yet.
So Mark, anything you want to share before we bring close?
It's certainly not been as philosophical as we usually are, has it?
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about the idea of philosophical. I mean, I think I'm in favor of like very practical conversations because it's very practical, you know, learning, development, and action taking that brings forward the things that we're interested in coming forth in the world. So in many ways, I think it's great, and I in general try and avoid philosophical conversations. Sometimes what I say can sound philosophical, but I would suggest that's because to some people at least, like the universal patterns of living systems feel philosophical because we don't have a relationship with them. They're not at all philosophical. They're very instructive and tangible if we have a grasp of them and have some experience of acting from them or implementing them.
Yeah.
Something that's been, I mean, as we're having this conversation and as you ask the question, Arnie, like what is coming to me is something that's been quite strong in my awareness recently, is the situation, which is very normal and very common, of having a gap between two people in terms of what a conversation might be about. So, for instance, it might be that we're looking at the same thing, but the understanding of each or the perspective of each person on that thing, whether it be something trivial as a sports game or like, you know, like what's wrong with the world or like any of these sorts of like questions or topics, we can have a gap in understanding. And so therefore in the conversation, people are coming at it from different angles or different sides, and that gap starts to become problematic in the conversation, or it starts to sort of become solid as the conversation goes on, and each person in the conversation is sort of digging more and more into their perspective. The gap actually reveals itself and actually can start to become problematic in the conversation, and even, you know, at the worst, it can start to erode the relationship and therefore make it even harder for something to happen. So I'm seeing that a bunch. Yeah, Arnie?
Are you speaking philosophically?
No,
Okay.
this is real
practical
stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So like a gap in understanding and having it be problematic.
Yeah, I think that's the
That's
whole
like
major thing, actually, a lot of it.
Totally, and it was very superficial.
Yeah.
When I say superficial, it's very superficial experiences, but it's the actual real experience that the people are having. There is also a different type of gap, which is when one person is speaking about a topic from a experiential, superficial angle, and the other person is speaking at it from what is universally true. And so you sort of get this like radial gap as opposed to the superficial gap. And that's like quite hard to bridge also because, it would be hard to concisely say too much more about that. And so it'd be better if I don't have to define that too much more. But there's, just to say that there's sort of like a depth gap that can occur also. And that's something I'm experiencing. So all of this is to say, like, what's very much in my awareness and practice at the moment is being aware of these gaps as they're coming about and trying to hold space so that the gaps don't become eroding of relationship at a minimum, but ideally being with another person so that that gap can close over time because of how we talk about the topic or the question or the experience.
Can I ask you a question?
You can.
Are you referring to the conversation that Kathryn and I are having? Or commentary
good
on
question.
the process or on, I'm confused about the frame of reference within which you're speaking and what your point of.
Yeah. I think I'm mostly speaking from my own experiences, like recent experiences, like, you know, when the question was asked, like sort of what's up for me at the moment, that's something that I'm very much experiencing. But I think it's really normal. And I would say that there were moments when that was happening today, for sure. And I'm not saying that in a critical way, but it's just a fact of life. And so
where we come from.
It's very, very normal.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to deal with it. I could share some of the stuff that Judith, I can't remember her last name right away, taught in QIC, conversational intelligence. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that too, because you're right, you come across it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, again, without trying to be too specific to one situation, a general approach is to point to it, to point out the gap. Again, like it depends a little bit on the quality of the relationship as to whether a person can receive that, but to like compassionately or empathetically as possible say, oh, it appears that, you know, we're speaking at this thing from different sides. So make it present and see what that enables in the conversation that wasn't aware previously. And ideally, like if it's like, oh yeah, it seems like we are speaking about this from this differently, then it can sort of lead to some questions around, okay, now that we know that there's a gap, like what does that bring up? What does that lead to being noticed, etc. What is now possible because we're at least agreed that there's a gap.
Yeah, I think languaging helps too. Changing the language is a way to sometimes shift that perspective so that you're on the same page.
Another thing like that is similar in terms of a suite of approaches is to like step back a few steps and go, okay, we're talking about this thing and, you know, person A is saying this about it and person B is saying something else about it. Like, what do we agree on about this thing? Like, if we kind of get a little bit deeper, like, where is their alignment? And try and find that. And by finding that, then we go, oh, yeah, we might not have been coming at it from the same perspective initially, but in this topic, in this question, we've sort of gone a little bit below the surface to find something that we do agree or align on. And then having found that place, that can provide a ground to move forward from.
So to translate that into Annie's conversation with her landlord, that the need for safety in a place is something you can probably agree on. And as they're concerned about the weather changes and the impacts of this changing climate on his property, and are there things that can be done to help mitigate that risk? Instead of talking about being one with nature, which he probably does not care about.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And I also wondered, Annie, in that particular instance, whether like risk also includes like, well, if there's a garden and something happens while people are gardening or something happens because there's a garden there, You know, is there any liability from the ownership for that, you know, maybe negative situation that occurred on them, etc. And so like there's kind of that like that legal risk piece. I wondered whether that was a piece of it too.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what they're thinking. Yeah.
But so it's kind of quite, yeah, it's
Yeah, you got
fear-based for sure,
old
but it's quite
people
simple.
exerting themselves, and if they had a stroke, would he be liable because they were extending themselves beyond their physical capacity on his property, kind of stuff.
I understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would just broaden that risk conversation because he's already there into one that doesn't really include those people, but where their actions could be supportive of his larger goal of what to do in terms of floods and droughts and how to manage that, which is something that California is going through. And the state as a whole is actually having to pivot their policy in a matter of weeks, actually, or months, from drought and taking care of water from that perspective to floods and taking care of water from that perspective, which is very different. And it's different ordinances, different ways of thinking, different needs, all that kind of stuff comes up. What's not seen is the connection between the two, and that you have to manage, again, the soil and the land, mitigate both, but you have to start there. And those things are not instantaneous. You know, you don't push a button and nature does something different. You have to build that up over time. So it's having that understanding about that whole cycle and then seeing what you need to do allows you to tolerate it's not working for a little bit, knowing that it's going to work eventually. Because we want it to work right now. And that's not going to happen. That's not how nature works. And that's what gets us into problems. You know, so we deal with the instant issue and then the effects of that bite us in the rear end because it has consequences. Instead of building it in so it gets better over time, we do an immediate thing and it gets worse over time. And we don't kind of get those two things. That's a systems perspective that helps people see that.
I appreciate the feedback.
I also, want to, like, I guess, express some gratitude because I think there's something generally in this idea that we're talking about that risk and people's appetite for risk, and you know, you could think about that as fear, sort of can be an entry point to bringing different things to the table. So, and I'm not sort of suggesting this as to do it manipulatively, but
right.
You know, I think we all have an interest here in us doing different things to respond to climate change and adaptation for it, and ideally, at some point, restoration type activities, so that it's not just adapting to a climate change situation, but actually doing things that support the climate being more favorable for us. And so, like, using, when it arises in conversation, people's expressed concern for these types of things and helping them connect some of the differences that we might be suggesting, such as a community garden or, you know, any number of things, you know, a actual forest as opposed to individually planted trees and so on and so forth, helping someone might be speaking to see that this is actually a risk mitigation strategy.
Yep.
If that's language that helps them, when, you know, what's going around in the back of our heads perhaps is, oh, these are the things that it's needed for a healthy system, and we don't necessarily need to talk about that. We can kind of use the risk or fear situation that is right in front of us.
Yep.
Okay.
was helpful.
Yep.
Well, it is time to go. I need to.
Yes.
I appreciate being with you.
And thank you, Ani, for your help very much.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
Blessings.
Wishing you both well.
And nice to see you, Mark. Very nice to see you.
Likewise. I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.